Hello, everybody. This is Tosca at NGO Soul and Strategy. And today we're going to do something a little different. I'm going to interview, and sometimes I will jump in myself, about a thought leadership product that I was involved in myself over the past 5 or so years. And that is the book Between Power and Irrelevance, the Future of Transnational NGOs, which will be published by Oxford University Press in July of this year, so very soon. I'm going to interview my two fellow co-authors, Hans-Peter Schmitz and George Mitchell, who I will introduce in a moment. I also want our audience to know that Barney Tallack, independent consultant and former longtime Oxfam leader, also very much contributed to several chapters and wrote an afterword in which he reflected as a practitioner on our thesis in the book. Because I have interviewed Barney recently for another podcast episode, which will go live shortly, today we are having a conversation amongst the three main authors. So that is Hans-Peter Schmitz and George Mitchell and myself. So let me first introduce Hans-Peter and George for you. Hans-Peter Schmitz is a professor at the University of San Diego here in the US. He was an associate professor at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University, which is where Hans and I first met some, what is it now, Hans? 15, 18 years ago? Amazing. And before that, Hans was a postdoctoral fellow and lecturer at the University of Chicago. And George Mitchell is the associate professor at Baruch College, which is part of the City University of New York City. He also is the Moynihan Research Fellow at, again, the Maxwell School at Syracuse University, and started out as a research assistant at the Moynihan Institute. And so George and Hans and I have been collaborating for a lot of years, as I said before, more than 15 years. And we're going to talk today about our book. Obviously, our book was written over a long period, about 5 years, as I said, and we submitted the book already to Oxford University Press about a year ago. So the book clearly will not be able to respond to some of the pandemic disruptions and talk much about the current and likely future impacts on the transnational NGO sector of the pandemic. Our conversation today has something which I'll call self-referential about it, because it's obvious that we're talking about our own books. So I'm going to be transparent right up front that this podcast does have a promotional angle to it. But like I like to be upfront about other things in my own work as well, we will talk honestly about the challenges as well as the rewarding elements of writing a book. And obviously we're unable to be objective about that. So let me start first by welcoming you, George and Hans.
Hello.
Thank you.
You're so welcome.
Happy to be here.
I'm looking forward to this conversation. Let me tell our audience first a little story. A little bit about how this all started, our collaboration, and ultimately the birth of this book. So we all met in the context of the Transnational NGO Initiative at the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. We're talking here about the period 2003 to 2019 when we were all involved. This was when our partnership was born, as well as the research that was at the basis of the book was born. The Transnational NGO Initiative, or TNGO Initiative as we used to call it, is focused on the governance, leadership, and effectiveness of transnationally operating NGOs. And it is a relatively unique academic program in a sense that decidedly about half of our activities and our outcomes were focused squarely on NGO practitioners and particularly NGO leaders. Of course, we undertook academic research, applied research, and of course we did teaching, PhD advising, etc. to our students, but we also had two major themes in our practitioner engagement work. One was on senior leadership development, and the other one was on organizational change, leadership and change management within the transnational NGO sector. Hans and I, at one point, were co-directors of the initiative for a number of years. And after Hans left for the University of San Diego, I became its sole director. So with that long introduction, let me turn to you, Hans and George. Tell us a little bit about what you thought was unique about the Transnational NGO Initiative, or simply maybe tell a story or two, a memory. So maybe, Hans, I'll start with you.
Sure, yeah. I mean, you already pointed out what was unique about it, that most of the questions that we ask in the research were generated from practitioners with large international NGOs. So Oxfam, Plan, Amnesty International, some of these organizations were very important in telling us what kinds of challenges and issues they had. And we then went about trying to create research agendas around it. And I think that's a relatively unique thing because typically academics don't necessarily operate in that way. They typically look at prior academic research and try to make a contribution based on that. And we took a decidedly different approach by really listening to the sector and then asking, okay, so the sector is interested in digital things. Why don't we do a project on digital things? And I think we're going to talk about that later.
Indeed. George, you want to jump in and also reminisce a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, I think back often to those early days of the TNGO Initiative back in Moynihan very fondly. It was a really great experience. I think the element we used to talk about a lot was the virtuous feedback loop between practitioner engagement, teaching, as well as research. And it is, I think, fairly unique, especially in academia, which in academia, scholars often look at practitioners and NGO leaders when they are studying that field as though these are subjects to be studied rather than partners in a mutual learning experience. And I think what the initiative did really well was to listen a lot to the field and to listen to practitioners, what questions they had and what they needed for themselves. And the initiative was very responsive to that. So we started off with our research project just getting really interesting data, not just what we were getting back from the interview study, but in terms of what questions we should be asking in the first place and what kind of information would be useful for practitioners. So I think especially in an academic setting, that focus and commitment was certainly a unique one.
Indeed. So maybe that then naturally makes a segue to first of all, the main claims that we make in the book, Between Power and Irrelevance, the Future of Transnational NGOs. What are the main claims we make, and how does this mix of academic strengths and practitioner knowledge, how does that come through in the book? Maybe George, first you.
So the book's premise basically is that a lot of NGOs, more and more I think, have embraced very expansive mandates. They've decided they want to pursue strategies that address the root causes of societal problems through more transformative kinds of change, especially long-term change that might take a generational type timescale. But the sector is still governed or situated within what we call in the book this architecture based on the charity model, quote unquote, as we refer to in the book sometimes, that really demands NGOs to stick to this sort of pre-21st century notion of what's appropriate charitable behavior. And this comes forward in the way NGOs are sort of organized literally as charitable organizations and the kinds of regulations in many countries that NGOs need to abide by, as well as cultural norms in different countries where NGOs are expected to do things like spend money immediately on current programming, and it's much harder to fundraise for research and development to ensure future program effectiveness and things like this. So NGOs in some sense have almost reached the limit of almost what's possible in their current organizational form and structure, and in terms of the current culture that the NGO environment really exists in, dominated by more kind of pre-21st century notions of charity and addressing symptoms more so at the root causes. So what we argue in the book basically is that NGOs need to apply their zest for transforming structures to transform the structures of their own sector.
Mm.
They can really spread out their wings a little bit more freely to embrace their new roles as movements, as facilitators of movements, as brokers, as thought conveners, and so forth. Without doing that, they're always going to face these frustrations and constraints, attendant to being regarded as though they're almost old-fashioned style charities doing very simplistic kinds of short-term work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Hans, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's exactly right. And if you want to give it a little bit more of an academic bend, you'd say there is a growing literature among academics that talks about why are international NGOs in trouble. So this is not something that's not just discussed among practitioners, but also among academics. And there are people who make arguments that NGOs have gotten too large, too big in order to really change effectively. And they get too focused on organizational survival, and they're ocean tankers that have a hard time really redirecting. And then there are other people who argue that NGOs there's simply too many of them, right? And as a result, there is more competition and they're undercutting each other and they're getting more competitive. And then there's a third set of people that say, oh, they've just simply have become too successful. And the more successful they have become, the more they sort of have to sell out and to sort of work with people that are not necessarily as interested in their agenda. And I think we make a complementary and very important additional argument. We're saying none of these arguments are wrong, but all of these arguments are forgetting that that these NGOs come from somewhere and they're embedded in an architecture that constricts what they can do to begin with. So it's not just that they have become too large, too successful, or too many, but they are someone. And what they are is a nonprofit, and we need to understand that.
Right. I just want to make sure that our audience is able to track where we're going with the discussion. So when the two of you use the word architecture, Hans, why don't you explain a little bit more what we mean? What kind of architecture are we talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, I think, of course, every country has different kinds of regulations for its nonprofit sector. But there are some commonalities that are really important for understanding why nonprofits, as George says, have a hard time living up to many of their promises. And so, for example, one is that many nonprofits receive tax deductions for donations. So the donor receives it and the nonprofit, not in all countries, but in many countries. As a result of that, there is a certain idea behind that you are, for example, accountable to the donor and show the donor that you've done something with the money. As George says, you spend it on the cause that the donor prefers. And those are regulations and those are ways in which the nonprofit sector are set up that limit it, because the nonprofit sector, for example, cannot go out and raise money in capital markets, right? But if you really want to change the world, right, that's what it might take, right? And so there's a natural limit to the way how nonprofits operate right now in most countries in the world that directly undercuts their ability to live up to what they're claiming and want to do.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, and just to indeed emphasize something that was said earlier, our book is, in terms of data, both academic data as well as practitioner data, is primarily drawing from the experiences of mid to large size transnational NGOs that are also founded in the global north. So we want to be clear that we're not talking so much here about small or grassroots organizations. And in all cases, our book is about those that work transnationally. So George, walk us a little bit through the topics that we cover in the book. What should readers expect to see?
Well, we cover quite a lot of ground in the book. I don't know if we intended to be quite as ambitious as we ended up becoming. Kind of why it took 5 years to write, many more years in development even. So basically, early on in the book, we addressed the urgency for the need for change in the sector, and some of the major external change drivers that many practitioners, I think most, will be very familiar with. We then draw on some of the thinking about nonprofit organizations and what it means to be a charitable organization to think about the sort of nature of this architecture that NGOs exist in, and how that presents certain opportunities, but also constraints that affect the ability of NGOs to realize new roles and to achieve new aspirations. We talk a little bit about how strategies have shifted over time from the more sort of short-term, I use the term ameliorative type strategies that are addressing sort of more of the immediate symptoms, to much more complex theories of change that we see today. We talk about the power of NGOs and how the notion of legitimacy and therefore accountability is so important for the power that NGOs wield. And in the latter part of the book, we look at a lot of interesting things NGOs have been trying to do to change and to adapt, to remain or become more effective, efficient, accountable, and relevant. And in doing so, we examine a lot of the challenges they confront, most of which, many of which, are challenging because of this mismatch between the architecture in which NGOs operate and NGOs' current aspirations and strategies that in many ways are sort of breaking out of that architecture or have moved beyond what that architecture is willing or able to support. So we talk about topics like going digital, becoming a more kind of digital rather than a brick and mortar type organization, and how to support more organic social movements that occur digitally. I'm a big sort of proponent of this idea of being more outcome oriented and taking impact more seriously. So we talk about measurement and how that's a challenge for NGOs. We talk at length about governance and leadership issues. Part of the architecture is how NGOs are structured in terms of their form. And many NGOs have tried to become more accountable through governance reforms and other things like that. Toward the end, we talk about collaboration as well as mergers and acquisitions and how these can be tools for scaling up impact to kind of, in some ways through M&A, mergers and acquisitions especially, to kind of work around some of the limitations of the architecture. And then in the final chapter, we try to bring things together a little bit in talking about how the sector itself needs to be a better advocate for itself and to organize or somehow understand what do NGOs want to be as organizations? What does the sector want to be as a sector? And how can it influence how it is understood, how it is regulated, how it relates to traditional philanthropic cultures, so that it can create a better environment that's more conducive to its future success, rather than trying to continue to kind of struggle to make things work in an existing architecture that really is no longer fit for the future, really, of these organizations and how they've evolved.
Yeah, and I'm glad to kind of reflect and realize that some of the topics, particularly in the second part of the book around digital strategies and tactics, as well as digitalizing as organizations, if I could call it that way, topics like measurement, governance, and also mergers and acquisitions are very much alive in the current practitioner discussions as we go through the pandemic and are looking at what will be the new world, after this pandemic. Hans, tell me a little bit, for whom is this book written, and for whom do you think it hopefully will be relevant?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's important to emphasize as well is simply to say we're not proponents of arguing that nonprofits should basically take a leaf from the for-profit sector or become like for-profits. Because I think often that is suggested as a solution to the nonprofit. And I think it's important to get our book as understanding that being proactive as a nonprofit and collectively being proactive is really the key here, rather than imitating other sectors and trying to fix your problems through imitating them, right? And so I think that's an important thing, because I talked about capital markets and all these kind of limitations. I'm not arguing, or we're not arguing that this is sort of the answer to that.
Right.
But in terms of, the audiences, I mean, yes, there is an academic audience. I explained, sort of what our contribution is to that. And we're complementing how other people have thought about why NGOs are significant actors in world affairs. and what are some of the limitations that they're facing. And I think we make a unique contribution to that. But I think the main audience that I understand, I've been sort of engaged in thinking about is people who are entering the sector, who maybe are students who want to work in the nonprofit sector, who want to work for international NGOs, and who need to understand in a relatively narrow space, what are some of the key challenges and key issues. Of course, the leaders themselves can read this. It may not be all news to them, but it might be useful to get our take, right? It's a particular take. It's good for them to agree and disagree. So it's written for them. Anyone who studies NGOs, of course, is also target audience.
Right. Yeah. So indeed, on the last set of audiences that you mentioned, we think that managers and leaders of transnational NGOs might find the book interesting if they ever have time to read. Of course, is always the question. Consultants like myself, analysts, I would say also in the large consulting companies might find this book helpful. Now, let's talk for a moment frankly about the main challenges when we try to write a book that combines scholarly and experiential perspectives. So maybe turning to you, George, that is, I think we strongly believe in that, right? That has been part of our, the kind of the heart of our collaboration over the last 15 years, but it's also challenging at times. Can you talk a little bit about how you experience that?
So the academic writing genre is a very specific one with very specific kinds of expectations about what constitutes knowledge and how ideas are expressed. I think a lot of practitioner readers are probably familiar when they maybe try to read an academic article now and again to see how sentences are qualified so many times, and you want to just say, well, what's the point here?
Yeah.
Pages about the methodology and this and that and the other thing. And there are good reasons for why that's done in academia. And it's important to understand where knowledge comes from. On the other hand, there is a tremendous amount of experiential knowledge that exists in the sector that we knew was valuable and wanted to draw very heavily from. There's a lot of great insight from people with that knowledge, but the knowledge doesn't necessarily come from an academic place where someone has done some sort of a representative survey or employed some sort of formal methods. So when you're approaching writing a book like this, you have information from these different kinds of knowledge communities, you might say. When you speak more to an academic audience, you're speaking less to the practitioner audience, and vice versa. And you have to be careful never to say something that would be sort of wrong in a certain sense to an academic reader, while also never saying something that would really shut off a practitioner reader who would see jargon or too many qualifications and just be sort of turned off by that writing style. That's been a continual struggle, I think.
A delicate dance.
Yeah, a delicate dance. But what I think the book does benefit from is that we all respect, I'm making a dichotomy here that's a false dichotomy, but we all respect knowledge from both of those kinds of perspectives, and we understand why different kinds of knowledge is valuable to different kinds of audiences. And we've tried to write a book that is mutually respectful of all those perspectives, while also really gaining in an eclectic way the benefits from both of those knowledge sources, both academic as well as experiential.
Yeah, and of course our readers will have to see whether we were able to live up to that aspiration. Hans, I'm curious, did you want to add something to this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, that's right. And, you know, and I think there's also a different purpose to each of these knowledge productions, right? So an academic tends to think a little bit more about advancing knowledge in a particular academic field for its own right. And so the book was walking a little bit of a line between saying, here are certain things that you can learn from this book, like tomorrow, on Monday morning, you can do something with this, right? And that's not the way academics want to really produce knowledge.
Right.
Because they will typically say that is not good knowledge.
Right.
Because it's not, you know, and that's sort of the difference between someone who writes a policy brief or it's just a different genre, and it thinks more about, okay, I'm not looking for the best answer here. I'm looking for a good enough answer, right, that doesn't get things wrong. And I think academics often focus on trying to make sure they get the best answer, right? But the policymaker typically doesn't have that luxury. They just have to discern between the options. And I think that's where our book was trying to serve both well enough in order to be substantive enough for academics, but also useful enough for practitioners.
That's right. Yeah, and I think we all, at a microcosm level, the three of us also, we learned so much from each other over those 50 years. And our collaboration, by the way, is still going strong. We are definitely going to do some other great things, right? But it's been such a valuable learning experience for me, for sure. So before we get to the end of the interview, I'm going to give you an open floor, if you will, to talk a little bit more about some of the other kind of contributions that the book makes, either to an academic dialogue or discussion that's going on, or to a practitioner discussion. And maybe I'll fill in a little bit on the practitioner side, and I'll let the two of you talk about academic contributions that this book makes in terms of the thoughts that it puts forth. Maybe George, you first?
Sure. I think on the academic side, there's surprisingly little work, although more and more, I think more recently, that understands NGOs as organizations that are governed by boards, that are led by leaders, that are managed by managers, that exist in a particular operational context and legal context and so forth. A lot of academic research tends to be more abstract, looking at NGOs in terms of the norms and ideas they're promoting and the campaigns that they're involved with.
Right.
So, I'm encouraged to see more and more attention to NGOs being studied as organizations from more of a managerial point of view, you might say. And I think our book obviously is very sensitive to that, of course. On the practitioner side, the academic perspective offers a really, really useful framework for understanding why the work of NGOs in terms of adapting for the future is so frustrating oftentimes. Academics don't often present those frameworks in an accessible way to those who would best benefit from them. And in the book, we've tried to cut through that a little bit to sort of explain this idea of the architecture in terms that I think most readers would instantly recognize, but in a way that's very highly organized. So when you're confronting a new situation, your brain is already sort of trained or sensitive to thinking about, well, this problem is of this type and it fits in here and here, so I can think about my options for confronting this problem, because you have a kind of a framework that's more rigorous to help you organize your thoughts. Academics are really good at producing these kinds of frameworks or explicating the appropriate context. You just have to do it in a way that resonates with people and that is practically useful. So like Hans mentioned, you know, on Monday morning, you know, you have a plan.
Yes, that's right. Hans, maybe I'll ask you before we get to the end of the interview, can you highlight a couple of conclusions from the chapter on NGOs going digital, as we call it, since I think that is also in the current pandemic particularly relevant. Don't want to put you on the spot, but maybe just a few bits from that chapter.
Sure. And I think, you know, the COVID-19 crisis is basically, you know, despite the fact that we're not talking about it specifically, but the book is about it, right? Because we're essentially arguing that NGOs and the sector overall is going to be repeatedly facing some crisis. And if they're not taking on a bigger bite and trying to deal with bigger questions, then these crises will just reinforce being passive and being not proactive enough. And I think the digital chapter sort of brings that out a little bit, and it really emphasizes something that where the NGOs really face a major sort of watershed. They can basically decide to remain organizations that are essentially driven by staff and by their principles, or they can decide to become more supporter-led organizations that really become more of, as George says, facilitators of broader movements. And I think those are some stark contrasts. And we're not arguing that either direction is the right direction, right? I mean, I think every organization will have to decide what they're good at and what they want to be good at. It's not that there's only one way. But now with the digital age, I think there are some opportunities that these organizations need to think about. And I think our book helps them maybe think about these things a little bit more systematically. That's sort of the main point.
Yeah. And then I'll take the mic for a moment and just add to that. I think our book maybe, from a practitioner perspective, adds value in three ways. One is that I think we truly, based on all the data that we represent in the book, we truly have a good understanding of the reality and perspectives of NGO leaders, right? What is their world like? What are their competing values that they have to balance every day like? Because we've had that consistent leadership perspective throughout the 15 years of researching and being engaged together also in practitioner oriented work. The second contribution that I feel the book makes is we are talking a lot about organizational changes and change management in the book, especially in the second part of the book. And we're really concluding that the sector's change management capacity is woefully weak in proportion to the amount of change that transnational NGOs have to navigate through at this very moment, but already for the last 10 to 15 years probably. And the third contribution, something that I feel strongly about also in my own individual thought leadership as a consultant now, is that NGOs have to confront better the fact that there clearly seems to be a gap between the what academics would call the espoused culture, the aspired set of norms and habits and values and principles that we claim to have, and our real in-use behaviors. And I think that that gap, through the discussion in the book around the norms part of the book, as George talked before about the forms and the norms parts of our claims in the book, is another, I think, contribution that I hope will be valuable to practitioners who read this book. So to finish up then, what else are the two of you working on now that this giant project is finally coming to fruition? What are you working on and what are your future projects? Maybe George first?
I think first some rest and relaxation after
well deserved.
a serious time commitment over the course of many years writing the book, and obviously with recent COVID disruptions that have hit academia pretty hard, as many industries very hard. So yeah, I have a number of academic projects in the works. I'm very interested in the role of information in the nonprofit sector, in the NGO sector, especially information relating to outcomes and impact. I'm also very interested in the ways in which NGOs and nonprofits are held accountable in a systemic way, in terms of how NGOs are pressured to report low overhead and other kinds of financial metrics are very commonly sort of analyzed to evaluate organizations. And you know, my own sort of hobby horse is trying to understand how can we sort of move the culture in philanthropy and in the NGO sector sort of away from this policing of trustworthiness as indicated by financial measures and towards more, well, are we serving the mission and are we achieving and investing in the right ways to achieve long-term impact. So a lot of my projects that are sort of in progress have to do with those kinds of themes.
I love the term of policing of trustworthiness, that we want to move away from that. Well, and certainly you have taught me the term outcome accountability, and I use it all the time in my consulting practice. And Hans, what about you? I know you've moved on to a somewhat new dimension, right?
Yeah, but I mean, George is involved in that too, because he has the much superior quantitative skills, so he gets all the credit for that. But let me say one thing first. Number one, look, George did all the work in bringing and shepherding the book. So
True.
He needs to get the credit, dealing with the publisher, dealing with the reviews. He kept us on track.
Here.
And we wouldn't have this book without Tosca, who is the host of this podcast, because we academics wouldn't have any sort of information that would have been valuable for. So I think it's important to point that out at the end of the podcast. We should have maybe done that in the beginning.
Oh, that's very gracious of you. And very typical for you, Hans, that you're always so humble.
But it's true. I moved on. I think one of the ideas that, of course, came out of this book is, well, if this is the case about the architecture, then you got to look at the architecture, right? And so my ongoing project is about philanthropy, and specifically billionaire philanthropy, and how those kinds of discourses actually shape the nonprofit sector, because we need to understand the ideas of people who have a lot of money to give away, like Bill and Melinda Gates, to understand why the NGOs find themselves in the situation that they're finding themselves. So I find that as an interesting additional project that builds nicely on our book.
Yeah, and I certainly can't wait to see the new outcomes for the two of you that we will be learning about in the next couple of years. So to finish up, if people want to learn more about the two of you, where should they go? George, how about you?
Well, I'm a little bit online, unfortunately. I do have a Twitter account, but I don't think I've ever tweeted using that account. I'm on LinkedIn. I do occasionally post on LinkedIn. If you're interested in any of my work, you can find me on Google Scholar under the name George E. Mitchell with the middle initial E, or on ResearchGate, which is kind of a specialty platform where academics share their research. A lot of academic research is behind paywalls. It's complicated, but if anything looks interesting and you'd like to get a copy of something, you can just message me through ResearchGate or send me an email, and I'll be happy to share anything like that with you.
Good, great. And I'll be sure to put those links to all the sources that George has mentioned in the show notes. And Hans, how can people find you?
I think that he said everything. George said everything. Where you find typically academics. Other than that, if anyone is ever in the San Diego area, that's probably worthwhile visiting.
It wouldn't be at any time, yes. But you're also on Twitter, right? And you're pretty active,
yes.
So
yes.
People can find. So I'll also put your Twitter handle in the show notes. Well, thank you, Hans and George, for all your insights in this podcast. And thank you for our 15 years and going collaboration, which I value so dearly. And thank you, listeners. If you're interested in buying our book, you can find it at all the usual booksellers sites, as well as on the Oxford University Press site as of July, or perhaps now already, in fact. And the Kindle version is already available on Amazon, amongst others. So this is Tosca, and I look forward to spending time with you on NGO Soul and Strategy next time.